Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as Daniel encountered King Nebuchadnezzar's dream and then, of course, his insistence on explaining what the dream was without being told what it was, he had to learn how to trust in you completely in order to deliver him from this situation. Lord, may we have the faith of Daniel to put our trust in you in all situations, knowing that you care for us and that you love us, and that you who did not withhold your own Son will give us all things that are needful. In Jesus' name, amen. So in the sheet that I handed out, it talks a little bit about some of the background for chapter 2. This is the beginning of the Aramaic section of the book of Daniel. Remember that Daniel is written in two different languages, and the Hebrew is the first chapter, and then it's the last section, last 4 chapters. So this middle part, chapters 2 through 7, is in this other language, which is the language of the Persian Empire. And it was also kind of like the most known language among all of the exiles, right? So in Babylon, there were not just exiles from Judah, but there were exiles from other countries as well. So the king had deported people who were part of the aristocracy, part of the royalty, and part of the priesthood of all the different countries. Right? So they always took influential people so that back in the country that they were from, there would be no uprisings because they would move people from other countries into those countries. So if you're a displaced person in a foreign country, you're less likely to start a civil war in that country. But back in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar had several groups of people from other countries, and they all spoke different languages. So Aramaic was kind of the common language of the time. So that's why that was the official language. Okay, and then we also are going to be looking at this chapter begins in 604 BC, which is the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar. And then we're going to learn about how this dream of Nebuchadnezzar's, I don't know if we're going to get as far as that part, but he talks about this giant statue with 4 different types of metal and then feet of clay. So, and then the controversial part is, what do those parts of the statue represent? We know they represent kingdoms of the earth, and which kingdoms they are referring to makes a big difference, because if you insist on believing, as the historical critical scholars do, that prophecy in the future is an impossibility, that's a basic presupposition of the historical critical methodology. They believe that Daniel couldn't have talked about something that happened after his time, so everything that he's talking about has to have taken place during his time. So then the 4 kingdoms are going to represent kingdoms all the way up to Nebuchadnezzar. So it's like talking about the kingdoms that happened backwards, unless somebody claimed to be Daniel and wrote the book hundreds of years later, which is another theory. So there's some theories that these kingdoms represent people from the Hittites and the Egyptians and the and after that would be the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. So he's in the Babylonian Empire, and if the 4th and final kingdom is the Babylonians, then you're not really doing any predictive prophecy. It's just talking about stuff that already happened in the past. So it's like looking backwards and then interpreting. Yeah. So that's not what Christians and even the Jewish people have believed throughout the centuries. So this is kind of like a newer interpretation of looking at the Bible from a historical critical perspective. But anyways, when we get to that section, we'll talk about what those groups are, what those kingdoms are, and why they're accurate. Okay, let's start at chapter 2, verse 1. Somebody read that verse.
In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him.
Okay, so again, in the ancient world, there was no such thing as 604 BC, right? Because we're talking about before Christ. So obviously, the dating methodology we're using now only took place in the Middle Ages, right? Looking back in history. So that's why they can only date things according to when kings ruled. So that's why Nebuchadnezzar, as the king, he's like the official beginning of the dating calendar. So everything in the country of Babylon was dated according to how long he had reigned. So this is the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. And we had talked about last time about Nebuchadnezzar when he started, and so 605 BC was the beginning of his kingdom. The second year is 604, and we can date that according to other historical documentation outside of the Bible. It's not, that is not at issue. And then the way that it describes him, it says he had dreams, right? That's just in English, but the literal way that in Hebrew you say it is that he dreamed dreams. And, in English that's kind of redundant, so we don't always include both of those words there. Because, the word dream can be a verb and a noun. So, but he had dreams, and his mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. And so the word there, the literal phrase is that sleep was upon him, which, that sounds like he's sleepy, right? But that's just a way in Hebrew of saying that he was having trouble sleeping. Sleep was upon him. It was upon him, but he wasn't in it. He was trying to get into the sleep, but he couldn't. So it's just kind of a strange way of putting it. But in English, whenever you translate a saying from another language, you have to put it into a saying that makes sense. Like one of the things that comes to mind is in the New Testament often, or even in the Hebrew Old Testament, when it talks about how you believe something with your whole heart. Well, the word for heart in Hebrew is not the place of emotions as we think about in English, but it's your stomach. So if that literally often reads that somebody felt emotion with their stomach, right? We feel butterflies in our stomach, but the idea that you would love somebody with your whole gut, it doesn't sound so romantic. So in English we say with your whole heart. So we translate it into what is meaningful in our context, but the original language usually has its own way of saying it. So you just have to be able to know how to say that. So, and then it says his mind was troubled. So what do you think that it's referring to?
Well, he didn't know what it meant.
Okay, so a lot of times we don't know what our dreams mean. So why would that be so troubling?
But didn't he keep dreaming the same dream over and over?
Possible, because it does have the word dreams, right? So it's plural. So, and that's actually a good point, because if it said he had a dream, that's one thing. But a lot of times in the Hebrew Bible, you'll find it uses the idea of visions and dreams. So I think that does indicate that it's a continual thing. He probably kept having the same dream. So, and that's part of it. It troubled him because he kept having it and he didn't understand it. Okay, verse 2.
So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell them what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king.
So, and then the rest of the sentence is verse 3. But let's look at some of these people who came before the king. So Nebuchadnezzar, this is like the first connection between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. Before this, he was, being trained. And how long was his training? Remember we talked about being in the wise men's school?
3 years.
That's right, 3 years. But now it tells us this is only the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar, so he hasn't even finished his training. He's still in the school. He's kind of a young whippersnapper. Why would anybody talk to him about anything? But the king he's trying to test these people who are in this wise men's school, and it includes, it says magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers. Now some translations translate that last word differently. Chaldeans, right. So the word Chaldean is a word that refers to a person from Babylon, a Babylonian. So some, like the King James Bible uses the word Chaldean, and like in the book of Isaiah, when it talks about God is going to bring down the Chaldeans, it's telling us how the end of the Babylonian Empire will occur, because God's going to send the Persian Empire to punish them. So here, the phrase Chaldean has been translated as astrologer in some Bibles because it refers to kind of like a general term for any but other person who the king would have employed to give him advice. So the magicians, of course, is similar to what we talked about with the Magi's back in chapter 1, verse 20, right? So, and remember, a Magi is like a wise person who would be like one who'd give advice, like an advisor to the king. We have, presidents have advisors, kings have advisors. So it's not necessarily like magicians, like a person who does magic tricks, obviously. It's more like, it does use the other phrases like sorcerers, enchanters, astrologers, and those in essence are what we think of when we think of magicians. But a magician in particular would probably be a person who understood the culture and the kind of like the mythology of the Babylonian gods, right? And so understanding that and then understanding how the so-called gods work in the world, right? So it'd be almost like a priest, right? A person who is involved in bringing about the will of, some of the gods of the Babylonian Empire, like Nebo. Remember, some of the names of Daniel's friends were changed. All their names were changed to other gods. Like, I can't remember, but we had. So Daniel's name was changed to a word that meant Belshazzar. Yeah, and of course that is. It probably means Bel, protect his life, right? So Bel is the Babylonian name of the god of the pantheon, the leader of the pantheon, which in the Babylonian mythology his name is Marduk usually, but they just had a different name for him. Like Jupiter is the Roman name for Zeus. Okay, so Bel is the Babylonian name for Marduk, and Meshach means who is what Aku is. So Aku is a name of one of the gods of Babylon. Abednego means servant of Nego, which is another god, the moon god, I think. And so, so a person who was a, whoops. So the magicians then are those people who are involved with kind of like the background information for the country and for the religion, right? So they're not quite priests, but they're advisors who understand these things. And then it also mentioned the enchanter. So enchanter is a person who does spells, right? A person who learns certain phrases of words in order to bring about supernatural power into the physical world. And of course, when it comes to the Jewish young men who are in this school, they would not be labeled as enchanters or sorcerers or astrologers, but they could be fit under the category of magicians perhaps just because they had to study the panthology, the study of the religion. They didn't believe it. Like people today go to school and you read you read Greek mythology, right? So the Greek myths, and even Shakespeare, a lot of his stuff is based on a lot of mythology. It doesn't mean that you believe that stuff. It just, those are stories that help us to understand the context of our Western culture.
So all these different kinds of people were summoned to tell the king his dreams, to read his mind.
Exactly, right.
Through his mind.
Okay, now that's the important thing, I guess, is because I guess the King Nebuchadnezzar was trying to test these people to see if they are actually able to give him an interpretation that was a divine interpretation. Because anybody, if I told you I had a dream, you could just tell me whatever you thought it was, and how do I know? But this was his way of testing them. So he said, okay, I'm not going to tell you what the dream is because I want a divine interpretation. So the only way I know it's a divine interpretation is if the gods give you the ability to read my mind. So that was part of his test, which is a good test, because if it's truly going to be a divine interpretation, then it has to be by God, who has the ability to give that to a person. And none of the other gods could do it, because none of the other gods were real. And that's what Daniel's able to do. That's why he's in this situation in the first place. It was for such a time as this that he was put into exile so that he could be a witness to this foreign king about who the true God of the universe is. Let's see. Sorcerers is a phrase in Hebrew or here it's Aramaic, I guess. It means those seeking knowledge. But compared to, remember we talked about seeking knowledge in the biblical sense, because what does it say in the Bible is wisdom? The fear of the Lord, right? So wisdom is true seeking of knowledge. It's seeking of knowledge from God. So this, in essence, is kind of like a way of saying the word sorcerer in the Aramaic is a person who seeks knowledge specifically by pagan, occult practices, right? So,
That would be like a psychic?
right. So yeah, today we've got people who say they'll read your palms or they'll read your future, things like that. Those are, yeah, and they,
Tea leaves.
yeah. There's lots of different versions of it in different cultures, right? So some of it comes from, from Asian ideology, like tea leaves things, but then others come from other religions like a lot of African pagan religions, witchcraft and stuff like that. Even in the Middle Ages, there was people who tried to do these things. It has to do with a cult, and it's bringing about a spiritual divine power into the world. So it's similar to enchanters, but those are people who use spells, whereas these people are interpreting something, like palm reading. I always think it's amazing that here we're talking about something that happened back, 2,600 years ago, and we still have this stuff today. We still have people claiming to cast spells, people who claim to be magicians, people who are sorcerers and astrologers, and it's kind of a shock that, in our day and age, that this kind of stuff is still around. But I guess the fact that people believe that there is more to this world than simply the physical world is evidence that there's got to be more. Purely materialistic believers, like atheists who say that nothing exists outside of this universe, they're the minority. Like 96% of humanity believes in a spiritual realm. It doesn't, they're not all right. I mean, we're talking about Buddhists, Hindus, and stuff like that.
I was just going to say, palm reading must be really popular. As long as I can remember, on the corner of Fairview and Hollister, right down that corner is the palm reader.
Yeah.
And she's been there for, 50, 60 years, and I said,
Is it the same person, or they just pass it?
I don't know, but that building that it says palm reading.
Yeah.
Past, present, and future.
So you knock on the door and they say, "Who is it?" And you say, "Well, then I'm not paying you, man. If you don't know who it is, then I already know you're a fake." Yeah. So a lot of those things are, I think that people who claim to be those types of things today are similar to, like, in the book of Samuel, when Samuel had died, the prophet Samuel died. Saul wants to consult him about going to war, and he asks a witch to bring the spirit of Samuel back. And when the witch sees the spirit of Samuel, she's shocked. And I think the reason is because in the past she was a fake. She never actually saw anything, and all of a sudden something actually happened. So, yeah. And so that we definitely can see that, those kind of things have been around for a long time, and God condemns that in the Old Testament. He says, anybody who does such things, witchcraft or sorcery or astrology or whatever, that those people should be condemned. And it's talking about within the country of Israel that it was condemned by execution, right? So it deserved death. And the reason is because you have to take a strong stance against the type of sins that can actually infect the rest of society. So people who were trying to involve people in the worship of false gods or the belief in false ideas like occultism, then those people were to be executed. And we're talking about the people of Israel within the country. It's not like God says, everybody outside of Israel who doesn't believe in God should be executed either. That's not the faith of the Bible. The faith of the Bible says that God's people are to be a witness, a light to the nations, so that other people will come to see the truth and repent and come to faith in the true God. That's what Jonah was about, right? He witnessed to Nineveh, the city of Nineveh, and the Assyrians there converted and put their faith in God. It doesn't say that they kept that faith in God, because within a couple of decades they ended up going back to their old worship of idols, and eventually God sent the Babylonians as a punishment to the nation of Assyria.
Oh, he was a little self-centered anyway. He sat in that stool, and he's going to watch the whole city just get zapped.
Right, and that part of that book it's not just about the Ninevites repenting. It's about Jonah needing to repent, because he didn't have the heart of God. He was more concerned with revenge than he was with grace. Yeah. And that's unfortunate. And that's true of believers throughout the centuries, that there's always the temptation to want judgment to fall on people who are doing evil instead of the grace that we ourselves have received, right? And so we see that throughout history. Let's see, the word there for astrologers, like I mentioned, is actually the term Chaldeans, and it's because it's just a general term here, covering any of those other people who would be in the king's service, people who were advisors. Okay, in verse 3. I'll continue on. It says, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. So, in essence, he's just repeating what it said before. And this is another aspect of the Bible. In the Old Testament, you see that there's a lot of things that are repeated, right? Like when you're reading through the book of the Torah, a lot of times it'll say what God will tell Moses what he wants him to tell the people, and then Moses will tell the people. And then the people will say, oh, thank you for telling us this thing that you just told us. It
Things in that way.
That's right. So it just repeats stuff. And the reason why it does that is because the Old Testament was not written to be read. Right. It was written to be heard. And you don't remember things if somebody says it to you once and then they just say, they move on. And, in a sermon, a lot of times things are repeated so you can remember them. Same thing is in the Bible, that things are repeated so that you can remember them. You don't always catch the point when you hear it the first time. So by saying it several times, it becomes easy to know, because you kind of anticipate what the sentence is going to say. Because it said in verse 1 that he dreamed dreams and he was troubled. And then in verse 3 he says, I have had a dream and it troubles me. Well, yeah, you just said that. We just heard that. But for the hearer, it's easier to keep track of the story when you repeat stuff.
I think it's also, as you mature, you need to hear things more than once.
Well, that might be some other difficulty, memory issues, right? But studies have shown that people don't normally remember things unless they've been exposed to it at least 7 times. Yeah, 7 times. And so we're talking about 7 touch points. It could be, you read it somewhere, you heard it somewhere, but you can't just, say it once. That's why I put things on the screen at church on Sunday. I put them in the bulletin. I say them in the announcements. Hopefully that's only 3 touch points right there, depending on if you looked at the screen because you showed up 5 minutes early or you read the bulletin at all. Otherwise, I got to say it to you 6 more times. Otherwise, you won't remember. And those are important things. But then think about the kinds of things that, as a congregation, we want people to remember. So I'm going to be introducing a mission statement to our voters meeting on the 28th. And so that we can have something that will be meaningful, memorable, and something that actually defines what we are as a congregation. So it's something to look forward to. And then, of course, that won't be something like I'll just say it once and then you will never hear about it again. It'll be something I'll talk about a lot in order to remember. That's right. First time, you got 6 more times. Okay, verse 4. Would someone read that?
Then the astrologers answered the king, may the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it.
Okay, so in your Bible, does it say that the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic?
Yes.
Okay,
Just
Yeah.
answered the king.
yeah, because in In some Bibles, they don't actually include that phrase in Aramaic, but it's in here to let us know that this section is the beginning of the Aramaic section. In order to, so this is the beginning of the Aramaic section, starting at verse 4. Notice when it says, "O King, live forever." Some translations put "Your Majesty." So, he's addressing the king. So they're looking to the king to talk to him, but then in a way they're trying to talk sense to him. Tell your servants the dream and we will interpret it. So that's the obvious way of, if the king says, "I want you to tell me what my dream means," and then he doesn't tell you what the dream is, and then they say, "Oh, just tell us what the dream is." So it's just setting up the story, the narrative. It's making it more tense, right? So in a lot of Hebrew narratives, it brings out a problem, and this is in good story writing in the first place, right? You bring up a problem, and then you have the trying to get through the problem. You come up with a solution, then you have the denouement, the tying up of the loose ends at the end. So this is the beginning of this type of narrative. Okay, the next verse.
The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble."
Oh, that's pressure.
That's right. There we go.
That's a lot of pressure on him.
That's right. So you can see how the type of king Nebuchadnezzar was. He didn't mince words. He wasn't very kind at all. I mean, yeah, he did mince people. That's right. Yeah. And, a note on this section where he says, he firmly decided, "If you don't tell me what my dream was, etc., I will have you cut into pieces." The phrase there is, "I'll made you into." Literally, it says, "I will make you into body parts," and which is a way of saying, "I'm going to dismember you if you don't do what I tell you." So Nebuchadnezzar, wasn't any better than the previous kingdom, right? The Assyrians. We remember in our study on Jonah, we talked about how the Assyrians were infamous for cutting people's heads off and stacking them on a pile in front of the doors of the city, the gates of the city, in order to scare people. So he's not any better. He's saying, "I'm going to chop you into pieces if you don't tell me what this dream is." And everybody knows that you can't read another person's mind. So, this is a death threat. But notice he's not necessarily, he didn't bring them all in front of him. This is probably just because Daniel was still in the training school. So he hadn't gotten to the point where he had any kind of authority to stand before the king. He was still in training, but he still had the same job as these other people did. So the fact that the other astrologers are the ones who have to face the king and hear his firm decision is it just goes to show what kind of a job it is, right? It's cutthroat, literally. It's not the kind of thing that you take lightly. I mean, it's a life and death situation when it comes to talking to a king, and we'll find the same thing is true in the same context when we get. If you looked at the book of Esther, the king in the Persian Empire, they had a similar absolute type of rule, so that if you walked into the king's presence without permission, he could have you executed. So our world today, in some ways we're a little softer, I guess, when it comes to this type of thing. I mean, the president of the United States is not going to have you executed if you walk into his office without permission. Might get arrested by the FBI or something like that, or Secret Service. Yeah, but you certainly won't get chopped into little pieces. But this kind of thing is still around, even though we think that we live in a enlightened time and people are more civilized, but then you have countries where they will chop your hands off for stealing, like in Muslim countries. That's still part of Sharia law, so they can still do that. And some countries will execute you for being found to be homosexual. like some African countries are still doing that. And so you have different ways of doing things, but Nebuchadnezzar, of course, is not somebody you want to butt heads with. Okay, in verse 6.
No,
Sure.
all those people that were threatened, what if they all came up with a different interpretation? Because that would certainly invite them to create something rather than getting killed.
Yeah, well, because he said, he says, if you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you killed. So they could come up with interpretations all day long, but if they didn't actually know what the dream was, they're still in trouble.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is like a no-win situation. There's no way anybody could do this unless, which is what Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do. He wanted a divine interpretation from the gods, because all these people who were working for him, these wise men, are supposed to be experts in the gods. They're supposed to understand the panthology, which is the study of the gods of the Babylonian Empire. They're supposed to be able to interpret what the gods are saying, but he wants to make sure it's not made up.
Well, I don't know, except if you don't give me the right answer, I'm gonna cut you into 4 pieces, north, south, east, and west, they're going. You're gonna wanna do something.
But he wouldn't know what the right answer
Well, I
was.
know, so it was.
Right, the king wouldn't know what the right answer was unless
Nobody else knows.
unless they could tell him what his dream was. Because reading his mind is proof that whatever interpretation comes afterwards must be divine, because there's no way that anybody could read your mind. So it was kind of an ingenious way of testing the wise men, although it's, kind of scary. Okay, verse 6.
But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and interpretation.
So notice that he's...
Oh, and great honor, I'm sorry.
Right, okay.
Skip the line.
Yeah, so it's interesting that, Nebuchadnezzar, he's not all, being mean here, but it still seems kind of crazy. He's saying, if you can't read my mind, I'll kill you, but, if you can do this, then I'm going to give you rewards. But so this verse right here, obviously he's trying to give them incentive, but that's kind of the kind of incentive that doesn't actually work if you can't do it. But what it does do is explains what's going to happen after this in the next chapter. That's right. Daniel and the 3 young men, his friends, are going to be raised to the level of authority in connection with this verse, because the king is saying, he's not just saying, if you can interpret my dream, tell me what my dream is and interpret it, then you save your life. He's not just saying that. He's saying, I recognize that you have a connection to the gods, and I'm going to bless you for that. So that's what's going to happen to Daniel. That Daniel, and because Daniel worships the God of Israel, the other 3 young men who also worship the God of Israel will be raised up. And so they're going to receive gifts, rewards, and great honor. So again, this is really to help set up chapter 3. And then he tells them, so tell me the dream. Okay, verse 7.
They answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation.
Yeah, they're just trying to save their skin there, right? Just trying to save their skin. I mean, they realize that what the king is asking is not possible.
Impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible, but it's interesting. Daniel says it's impossible later on, but he says it's impossible for me. But then he turns around and says, but it is possible for God, the true God, right? And so notice that if the other wise men are saying that it's really impossible, it's because their gods are fake. They have no faith in their gods. Paganism is about manipulation of the spiritual world. It's about you doing something in order to get something back. So, if anything, after this happened, I can imagine that the wise men would go back to their homes saying, okay, we need to get the gods to tell us what the dream is, so we need to start doing things. So like maybe sacrifice your first child, or offer a bull sacrifice, or all kinds, remember in 1 Kings chapter, is it chapter 18? It's the contest with the prophets of Baal, Elijah, right? So Elijah, he goes to King Ahab, or Ahaz, I guess. No, Ahab? Yeah, Ahab and Jezebel, right? And he says, let's once and for all show who the true God is. Let's have a contest. Whichever God can bring fire down from heaven onto an offering, then let that be the true God of this country of Israel, right? So Ahab and Jezebel were evil, the evil king and queen of the northern kingdom in the 8th century BC, and they were killing the prophets. And so Elijah was very bold when he went there. And then before the prophets of Baal could say, well, I don't think that's going to happen, the people said, yes, let's have the contest. And so they were kind of forced into it. And so what happened is when the Baal prophets were praying that Baal would send fire from heaven, nothing was happening. They're dancing around the offering, the bull, and then it says they're cutting themselves. They're basically trying to show the God how deeply sincere they are, and listen to us, God, please. We're even cutting ourselves. You got to listen to us, please. Answer us. And Elijah's just standing back saying, well, maybe your God has gone to the bathroom. Maybe your God's on a vacation. He's probably left the house and he can't hear you. And it's really funny. He is insulting them as they're doing this. So Daniel doesn't do that because he doesn't actually know. But I can imagine that these are the types of things that these pagan magicians are going to have to do in order to get this insight into the dream that they're not going to be able to do on their own. Okay, the next verse.
Then the king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. Right?
Yeah, so it's interesting to see that the King Nebuchadnezzar is very straightforward. He's not going to be talked out of his determination, his decision, right? His decision is, tell me what I was dreaming, and then tell me what it means. That's it. I mean, it's a simple request, but it's an impossible request. And then notice he says that he knows what they're trying to do. They keep asking him because they're trying to, what did it say? Gain time, right. So, I mean, actually in the Hebrew, it literally says you were trying to buy time. So, in English, we have that same phrase, but it's an economic term, trying to get something that they don't have. They're running out of time, and the only way they can maybe figure things out is if they can stall. And so he says that this is going to be a penalty for not being the kind of advisors. See, advisors are only as good as their education, but he gave them the best education that he could, right? So everything that was known at the world at the time was under consideration for the Magi at this time. And so he thinks, I'm the king, I'm not sparing any resource for you guys to go through this Wiseman school, 3 years of training, right? And then you better be up to snuff. And it's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to start reading people's minds. Okay, verse 10.
The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean.
Yeah, so they basically say what's on everybody's mind, recognizing that it's an impossible thing. But, and there's a truth to this. He says, there's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. And even Daniel admits he couldn't do it. And again, that's jumping ahead, but Daniel says he can't do it. Let's we haven't got to the interpretation yet, but the first question on the study sheet was, why do you think God gave Nebuchadnezzar the dream in chapter 2, verse 1, and how is Daniel pictured as an interpreter of dreams according to the Old Testament? Okay, so what do you think is the reason why God gave this dream to Nebuchadnezzar in the first place?
Show it down, so Daniel know.
That's right. To lift Daniel up, to make him the preeminent magi in the Babylonian Empire. And this isn't something that he could do on his own. Now, can you think of another person who was a Hebrew, who was enslaved in a foreign country, who through his dream interpretation, yeah. I mean, this story, it parallels the Joseph story in Genesis 37 so closely, it's amazing. And some scholars say that this is just a retelling of the same story. Some scholars have claimed, higher critical scholars, that this never happened, that this is just a Joseph story retold in the Persian Empire, and that there was no...
Of course, they also say that the Joseph story didn't happen either, so...
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, so higher critical scholars, whenever they see similarities, they say, oh, this was just copied, right? It's like, I mean, like the Star Wars...
Two people could ever go through the same experience that
Yeah.
1,000 years of history, right?
That's right. Yeah, like the Star Wars movie is just if you look at it closely, it is actually just a Western.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, it's a Western in space. People shooting guns. Good versus evil. It's George Lucas was a fan of old Westerns, and he just changed the context. And it's the same thing.
John Wayne.
Yeah. No. Well, Darth
Han
Vader.
Solo was.
Yeah, maybe Han Solo was John Wayne, but yeah, this is really a lot like Joseph, right? So you've got a person in a foreign land, as a young man, being told by a king to interpret a dream. Although Joseph wasn't told by the king to do it, but because he could interpret dreams, because that's what Genesis 37 is. What was Joseph doing in that section?
Was he in jail?
No, that was chapter 41 of Genesis. Chapter 37 is when he's a young man, and he has a dream, and he tells his family members and his brothers.
Yeah, about bowing down to
Yeah, I saw there's 12 stars in the sky, and the sun and the moon all bow down to me. And then it talks about the 12 bushels of wheat, and they all bow down to my bushel. And
Talks about the family.
now he didn't necessarily interpret that, but it was pretty obvious what it was talking about, right? Because there was 12 brothers, and they were bowing down to him, and they even said to him, "Well, do you think we'll ever bow down to you?" And he doesn't say yes or no. He just says, well, "That's just what my dream was." He was kind of naive in the fact that he was showing off a dream, thinking that it would. I mean, what did he think his brothers would think after he said that dream? They were already jealous of him because he was his father's favorite, and once he told them the dream, they hated him, and that's why they tried to kill him. But God used their evil for good, because if it wasn't for the fact that they tried to, they were going to kill him, then they decided to sell him, and then he went to Egypt, because that whole point was so that God could raise him up for His glory, and use him for to save. Genesis 51, where after the father dies, Jacob dies, and Joseph's brothers come up with this plan and say, your dad told us to tell you before or after he died that you should have mercy on us and not get revenge on us. And he cries and he says, why do you think I want revenge on you? He says, you meant this for evil, selling me into slavery, into Egypt, but God meant it for good, for the saving of many lives. So Daniel is in the same situation, and I think that that's the purpose of the book of Daniel, is the saving of many lives. Daniel is going to show us that he's going to save the Israelites in the exile and bring them through it, so that ultimately the ultimate saving of many lives will happen through the birth of the Messiah, who comes from the line of David and the tribe of Judah. There's a couple more verses, though. Let's see. Verse 11.
The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh.
So again, sometimes even pagan people get it right. He is, the astrologers are correct that that nobody except for the gods, or you can say this is a divine revelation. Any revelation about what another person's thinking has to come from, from a divine source. Now, obviously, they're pantheists; they believe in lots of gods. But Daniel believes in only one God, monotheist. But he believes that there's only one God possible. There's only one God of the universe. So these other pagan wise men are going to learn the truth that their gods are impotent, but the God of Israel is omnipotent. So definitely, this is going to bring about change, but it's going to be similar to the same story of Joseph. When Joseph interpreted interpreted the dream as, well, I don't know. He didn't interpret his own dream, but his brothers were jealous. He interpreted the king's dream, Pharaoh, in Genesis 41, and he was rewarded. But I think that you kind of have both stories combined in this story, because he interprets the story of the king, and the king rewards him. But then the other wise men, who are like his peers, they hate him because of this. And so we see there's going to be this divide that's happening. Let's finish off with verse 12 and 13.
This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So that the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends and to put them to death.
So I don't know why the king was so angry. I mean, I guess when he says that nobody can do what you want is like insulting the king, right? The king is saying, I believe that I'm a god, and I believe that there are gods, and so if you believe in the gods, then you'll just do what I'm telling you to do. Tell me what my dream is. But he gets angry. So his anger is evidence of his megalomaniac. That's a psychological situation where you believe that you have illusions of grandeur, that you believe that you're a god, right? Remember David Koresh from the Branch Davidians? He thought he was Jesus reincarnated. And there's other religions like they're called the Moonies, the followers of Sun Yat Moon. He was a Korean pastor who claimed to be Jesus reincarnated. And then he died a few years ago. So I was like, what? Jesus died? I didn't think that was going to happen. So there's all kinds of people like this. So his anger is evidence of his belief that how dare you not give me what I want? And there's people in the world who think that they're so deserving of being catered to that they'll strike out in anger against anybody who doesn't agree with them. So that's kind of that's a sign of a psychological disorder. Okay, and then
how would he ever know they'd given him the truth?
Again, the test was, tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me what it means. So the only way that he believed that they would be able to give him a correct interpretation if they could tell him what it meant, what it was. So that's an impossible thing to know. I can't read a person's mind, but if I could tell you what you were thinking, you would probably be impressed. And then anything else I said after that, you might believe. So you're right. It's possible that they could, if they could somehow read his mind, like maybe some demonic revelation, because the Bible doesn't say that miracles are the exclusive right of God alone. The devil is a spiritual being, and the devil can do miraculous things in order to twist the truth, right? So that's why it says in 1 John chapter 4 that we should test the spirits to see if they are of God. But notice that when Jesus cast demons out of people in the Gospels, the Pharisees said he's casting out Satan with the power of Satan. And Jesus is like, how does that work? He said, if the devil, if his house is divided, it cannot stand. Or if a house is divided against itself, it cannot stand. If the devil is casting out the devil, he's already losing, right? So the devil's not going to be casting out the devil. So it only makes sense. But that's what they claimed, and their reason was that Jesus cast demons out on the Sabbath day. And it says, do not work on the Sabbath day. So obviously he broke the Sabbath day, and he broke God's law, so that anything he did on that Sabbath day had to be from Satan, not from God. That was their logic. And Jesus' logic was you don't understand the Sabbath day because you yourselves will lead your ox to water and to food on the Sabbath day. That's work. You're taking your oxen out into the pasture. But why are you doing that? Because of the care for the animal. And then he says, aren't people more important than animals? If you're willing to so-called break the Sabbath day by feeding your animals, why shouldn't God be able to, or the Messiah be able to care for people by healing them on the Sabbath day? So Jesus did that on purpose in order to show their misunderstanding of the Sabbath law. But ultimately, the idea here was the king was testing them to see if they could give him a true interpretation, because it was revealed by a God. And since they couldn't do it, what it really showed was that the gods were false. But Daniel is going to be able to prove to Nebuchadnezzar that there is a true God, and that it's not the Babylonian gods, it's the God of Israel. So, this whole book is going to be a witness to this nation. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of a nation who believes in lots of gods. And in fact, he thought he was a god himself. And all this is going to be shown to be false, and that the only true God of the universe is Yahweh. Okay, well, next week we'll find out how Daniel responds with his three friends when they get ready to put him to death. So we'll start in verse 14 next week.